Craig, thank you for joining. And again, Craig is a longtime international human rights lawyer who served as director of the New York office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. He resigned after publicly accusing the UN of failing to address what he calls a textbook case of genocide that's happening in Gaza. And his letter of resignation was leaked and became a bit of a viral sensation. So Craig, please tell us what made you resign and write that scathing letter.
Well, Katie, this conversation actually began in March after the series of atrocities that were happening on the West Bank, including the pogrom in Hawara and a number of Israeli military assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank. And, at that moment, I sensed a real careful, trepidatious approach on the part of the UN that was not responding with the level of concern and conviction that one would expect in the face of those kinds of atrocities. And I felt very much like this had been a trend that had been building over the course of many, many years, and it offended me. And so I was speaking out quite publicly as a UN human rights official, as I have on human rights situations in dozens of countries all around the world and on all continents. But there's something different when you speak out on Israeli violations. There is a well-oiled machine out there that will persecute you like crazy, make your life a living hell for a period of time, smear you and attack you, and bring pressure on the UN itself. And that's exactly what happened. There were a number of Israel lobby organizations that, in addition to doing all sorts of online smears and so on against me, brought pressure on the UN to try in some way to punish me. Now, of course, it would be absurd for a UN human rights official to be punished for speaking out on human rights in any direct way. But there was an impact, and I felt it very strongly, and there was an effort to silence me from the organization itself, from the political corridors of the organization. And I had always said in my work in the UN for 32 years that I would stay on the inside working as long as I felt like I could do more good on the inside than the outside. I come from the human rights movement outside of the UN. And up until that point, I felt like, or let's say up until this year, I felt like I was doing more good. I was working in solidarity with human rights movements all around the world and able, I think, to make a contribution without the kinds of constraints that I felt were growing in the organization. But this was something different. This was a real kind of a crackdown. And so I made a decision at that point that, the time had come. And so I wrote to the High Commissioner for Human Rights in March already, told him I was concerned about these trepidatious approaches, about a lack of conviction, about what I perceived as open fear of powerful states like the US, the UK, Israel, and of, these lobby groups that had been set up to put pressure on the UN. And that I thought we were losing the way and that we needed to stand up and be more principled. Well, of course, since then, the situation only got worse in the West Bank, but then absolutely in Gaza, starting with the October events. And that's when I sat down and decided to just clearly on the record in my capacity as the director of the Human Rights Office in New York, to put that letter to the senior most official responsible for human rights, the High Commissioner, where I laid out my concerns with regard to Palestine, with the UN's role for a very long time there, with the path that the UN was on that made it very ineffective in protecting Palestinian human rights, and to set out what I thought was a more principled course that was more consistent with the norms and standards of the organization. And interestingly, that letter was leaked first, as far as I can tell, to some Israel lobby groups, which used it to attack me. And then it went viral. And I have to say,
Mazel tov.
right, there was actually a tidal wave of support that far overwhelmed any of the attacks, criticisms, death threats that I've been receiving in recent days. Smears, the smears, we're all well aware of this tactic by these pro-Israel groups that if you dare to criticize human rights violations committed by the Israelis, that they will smear you as an anti-Semite. So these groups actually put together a little research team, and they dug out everything I've ever said publicly about human rights since the 1980s. And they weren't able to find a single utterance of anything remotely anti-Semitic.
Right,
so what they did was they consolidated all of the criticisms of Israeli violations I had made through the years and said, since he criticizes Israel, he's an anti-Semite,
Right.
And of course, we know the trick. We know it's not true, but it still hurts. And, people who dedicate their life to fighting bigotry and for human rights and so on, when you hear those words, there's a little bit of a cut to it. And when anti-Semitism is a very real thing, and there are Nazis marching in the streets, and it's ascendant again, and these far-right groups are persecuting and killing in the name of their insane ideologies, those words hurt. I don't think they convince many people anymore. And as I pointed out in my letter, I said that, criticism of Israeli human rights violations is not anti-Semitic any more than criticism of Saudi violations is Islamophobic. Right. Criticism of violations from Burma is anti-Buddhist, or criticism of violations by India is anti-Hindu. And I think it just bears repeating over and over again because it is a smear tactic that's used. But all of these things taken together created this climate of fear in the UN, and I think knocked the UN off course, together with a distortion of the political agenda that began with the advent of the Oslo process 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I made a number of comments about that as well, and what I thought was a better course.
Let's say we had a courageous UN, what would they be doing?
Well, because I've worked on human rights in, as I said, dozens of countries in all regions of the world. There's a kind of a standard package here when you have these kinds of situations that are always applied, that include things like, first of all, a law-based response based on human rights law, humanitarian law, the Charter, not deferring to some amorphous political formula or some kind of exceptionality where, yes, of course, ideally, but that doesn't apply here, which is the way that Israel's been dealt with for many, many years by the UN, perhaps forever. But really getting back to the law, the requirements of human rights law, humanitarian law, international criminal law, international refugee law, and the Charter itself. In all other situations, we demand equality. We would be demanding here equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. That's not happening. It's always, well, let's talk about two states and some Bantustans in the West Bank, and let's not do anything to insist that Israel has to conform to international human rights standards as well. Right. Let them have their ethno-nationalist state. Let them continue their settler colonial project.
Which they, of course, frame as Israel's right to exist and the right to have a Jewish state. I mean, they frame it, right? Instead of framing it as a settler colonial project, they frame it disingenuously as a project of Jewish safety.
But anywhere else, there would be a very clear proposition, and there would be a demand for a transitional justice process. There'd be a demand for an international tribunal. There'd be a demand for the right to return of those who have been purged from the land and for compensation for them. There would be a demand for the end of apartheid. There is an apartheid system. It's not even controversial in the international human rights community because it is a position that's been taken by every international human rights organization, mainstream Israeli human rights organizations, Palestinian, UN, independent UN human rights mechanisms. That would be the focus of attention as well. But none of that is there would be a move to provide protection for civilians, including a protection force in the country, as we've provided in so many other countries around the world. So none of that applies because of this kind of idea of exceptionalism that is opposed. And what has happened instead is that, especially since Oslo, you've had this game which is played in public where people will say some mantras like two-state solution, UN quartet, the peace process, all of these kinds of mantras that nobody believes really exist in real life. That it's not possible to have a two-state solution anywhere because there's nothing left for a sustainable Palestinian state. And Israel is not, under this government or any subsequent government, going to give up enough land for a sustainable Palestinian state, one. Two is, even if you had a two-state solution, it wouldn't address the human rights questions, the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, because they would be relegated forever, those who remain inside the Green Line, to being second-class citizens who are not equal, who can't have nationality, who can't have the same economic, social, civil, political, and cultural rights of other ethnic groups in the country. And so that doesn't resolve it. But when you don't want to address the real issues at hand, you'd simply say, we're going to have a two-state solution someday. Well, what has happened behind the curtain of Oslo and the two-state solution and the quartet and all of this. What's happened behind that curtain is that for this past 30 plus years, the situation has gotten worse and worse and worse. It has just been a smokescreen behind which you've had an exacerbation of the critical human rights situation of the Palestinian people, a continuation of settler colonialism, an expansion of illegal settlement activity. And that brings us to where we are today. And if the UN and the international community and some states in the West don't make a pivot toward human rights and away from this game that they've been playing for the past 30 plus years, we're entering into a very, very dark chapter in the history of the world. So I just think all we have to do is play by the rules here, as we would insist in other places, and that's the answer. For me, a single democratic secular state with equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, to which the Israeli lobby accuses me of calling for the destruction of Israel.
Right.
And I say, I'm not calling for the destruction of Israel. I'm calling for the destruction of apartheid. I'm calling for equality. I'm calling for the salvation of Israel and Palestine, in the process, because this is not, if the argument is the safety of Israelis, this is not a path toward the safety of Israelis. This is a deeply racist, extremely violent path on which that country has committed itself. And there's another way. It's called equality. But, many in positions of authority, including in the UN, don't dare to say so.